get stuck in this morning, of course, because 9 p.m. last night, you'll know, the much vaunted by Mr. Trump Liberation Day, as he decided to call it, according to him at the beginning of his speech, one of the most famous days in American history, apparently. Declaration of financial independence, or declaration of liberation, or whatever he referred to it as. That's how he sees it, and I thought it would be a good idea, and I've had a lot of messages, so I'm coming on the channel to just respond to everyone really in full, to have a chat through what it means, what tariffs are, what the implications are likely to be, and we're really preempting whether there'll be any renegotiation, what will happen, where will this all go, because we've got a relatively short time window here. We haven't had a reprieve yet of any kind. We saw with Canada and Mexico when President Trump started talking about this in the first place, trying to use tariffs as a bit of a weapon for negotiation, basically to get what he wants, whether that's an economic outcome or not, whether it's primarily for some other reason. So, for example, he was talking about drugs coming across the border and looking for those countries to do more to stop people coming from their own shores, whether that's realistic or not, whether that's workable or not. It certainly seems like one way of doing it. It's quite a big stick to try and hit countries with. Interesting, because apart from anything else, Ronald Reagan, who might be the most comparable Republican president in recent years, and I say that primarily because of, coming from popular culture, aside from anything else, as a general rule, without a career as a politician, although he did go a more traditional route and was indeed governor before he ran for president, of course, apart from anything else. So I guess we're just going to see what happens to an extent. With Canada and Mexico, he gave a 30-day window, which enabled more negotiations. We've been told for the moment these are coming in on April the 5th. Seems like a relatively strange day to choose, as that would be a Saturday, apart from anything else, but there we go. Whether we're going to hear today or later on at any point over the next couple of days that there's another hiatus for a while, it does seem like a very short notice in which to bring something in, but we'll find out, I guess. So what did he go for? If you sort of missed or couldn't stand to listen to all the ramblings of the speech, which I can understand, what did Trump go for in the end? He went for a blanket tariff solution, basically with a minimum of 10% across all goods being imported to the US. So there was questions over whether it would be reciprocal or whether it would be blanket, and the answer was both. Reciprocal would mean you tax me, I tax you. And it's interesting, isn't he? Because when he went about it in the speech, what he's done is he started from a position of, we're going to charge you half of what you charge us, but with a 10% minimum. So the UK, using a 10% tariff as his benchmark, is still getting charged 10%. I did think immediately perhaps we should put our tariffs up to 20%, because he would still only charge 10% then. But reciprocation might not be the way forward here with the way that Trump works. So let's get into that as we go along. So 54% on China, 20% on the EU, and it's being sort of lauded in some corners as a bit of a first possible benefit of Brexit. We need to say something here about the difference between an absolute benefit and a relative benefit, because everyone's worse off from this, make no mistake about it. There are figures this morning saying things like 25,000 jobs are at risk in the car industry, and the focus is primarily on our higher end cars, Jaguar Land Rover being a big producer, and then the BMW plant in Oxford, also in Cowley, being mentioned as somewhere where jobs are at risk. Solihull, where I live, has a JLR plant nearby, so it's one of the places which would be a matter of concern. But where is the price sensitivity on those cars? We don't know, and again, we'll dive into that as well, and what actually happens. But it's not helpful, can't be deemed as helpful. In isolation, it's bad for the UK. It's just not as bad for the UK as it is for the EU. 24% on Japan, 26% on India, 54% on China. No new tariffs for Mexico and Canada the way we see it at the moment. And then there's some as he rattled through his weak cardboard copy list that was blowing in the wind, it seemed. There were some small Asian countries, particularly, that have got some pretty tough times coming. Cambodia, Vietnam, some very, very significant tariffs on the way in those countries. The strangeness of the blanket is that there are places where the US does no trade with whatsoever, that are still going to get a tariff. So it seems interesting, but you can see the logic at a very simplistic level, and that is sometimes a level which Donald Trump operates at. And I don't mean that to be an insult per se. From observations in business, sometimes simple is the best way. Good business solves problems. Unfortunately, this isn't business, this is politics. What is he hoping to achieve? Well, what he's hoping to achieve is that people relocate factories. For example, Rolls-Royce, upcoming to Liberation Day or whatever you want to call it, have already started discussing moving some manufacturing to the USA. That's one way where you can get around this. Very, very, very difficult with cars to understand, because let's focus on cars, because a lot of the focus on the UK media has been about cars thus far, 25,000 jobs at risk, etc., etc. How do cars actually work? Do they have all the parts made in that one factory? Quick spoiler alert, the answer is no. They bring in parts from all over their supply chains, and in fact their supply chains are all over the world. So anytime a part moves across a border, there's a tariff. If you imagine a part was made in Germany and then shipped to the UK and then shipped to the US and then shipped back to the UK and then back to Germany and then to the US, those tariffs would be applied every single time that part moves across a border. That would increase the cost of that part massively. Now that's extremely disruptive. When you disrupt supply chains, what happens? Sometimes supply goes down. To cope, we won't see an immediate impact because we've seen a lot of inventory building in preparation for all of this. But there's no doubt it will significantly affect things, because you can't just click your fingers as a manufacturer and go, okay, well, we need now not to buy that from Germany or the UK. We need to buy it from our own country. American car manufacturers won't be able to do that. So it will increase the cost of American cars as well. And then you have to consider, we get more broadly into the game theory element of all of this. So at a really simple level, you might sit there and go, well, cars from the EU have got 20% more expensive, or no, all goods from the EU have got 20% more expensive, but the ones from the UK have only got 10% more expensive, but the ones from the US haven't got any more expensive at all. And of course, that's only true if in isolation parts aren't crossing borders to make those goods. So they're not complex goods, they are genuinely British made or EU made or whatever that are going to the US. What would you do if you were a US firm? Would you keep your prices the same and hope to massively increase your volume? Would you see an opportunity to put your prices up 2%, 4%, 6%, 8%, 12%, 15%, sit in the middle of the two, 8% because you'd still be cheaper than the price difference in the UK? Difficult to say, right? But those options are definitely going to be on the table, and business people aren't going to look past them and just say, well, never mind, we'll just carry on selling at the same price that we were. They're in business to make money, and they're going to maximise their profit opportunities. So if their potential rivals, if the substitutes for their goods have gone up in price, then they might look at putting their prices up as well. And they might make more money even selling fewer units if that's what they need to do. So who bears the cost of all of that? Well, of course, it's the consumers, right? The consumers will bear the cost. There's a bit of maths been done this morning that's widely accepted in Bloomberg that says the price increase could be about 4% through to the American consumer, so focusing on the US consumer, which can't be good news. Donald Trump has promised lower inflation, apart from anything else. That hasn't quite materialised yet. People are more concerned about stagflation. And then we'd probably have to look to, and bear in mind there isn't necessarily correlation between the two, but the stock markets and how have they reacted? Because in his first term, the Donald tended to retreat on things a little bit when the stock markets gave him a very negative reaction. We've already seen a pretty negative reaction in the stock markets over the last few months preparing for this, but then they've reacted negatively again, a relatively big sell-offs between 2-3%. Asian markets have done very poorly this morning. The FTSE's opened and moved down pretty rapidly as well. Can't be seen as a positive. So this is probably a good time to discuss what's going on here in terms of value creation or destruction, because the logic says that free trade, the rising tide raises all boats, right? But Trump's counter argument would be, well, whose boat is rising? And actually, it's not our job to increase global GDP, right? I care about America's GDP. And what he's potentially missing out on is that in terms of American exports, if the rest of the world grows, they've got more money. If you look at China, for example, and the burgeoning middle class that has been created over the last 30 years over there, or massively expanded, more accurately, if they're growing, they can afford to import more goods, including goods from the US. If they're not growing, or they're growing more slowly, then they can't import more goods, or they won't increase at the rate that they were going to increase at. So that's what you're talking about when you consider, global value destruction or creation. And this is largely a value destruction exercise. It's a return to a system that was used, or the increase in a system that was broadly used, pre-war, apart from anything else. Trump's take, as I say, is quite simple. If people are charging us more than we're charging them, that doesn't seem very fair. It strikes me the way that Trump thinks about the world, that this is stage one, really. We're going to charge you half. So it's definitely, we're really serious about this. We're going to do it in a couple of days. We're going to charge you half what you're charging us. But if we really don't like it, we don't get what we really want out of all these separate negotiations, and I don't think he wants something from Cambodia necessarily, right? Let's be clear about that. But it's just easier to put that blanket tariff on. 600 billion by the way of imports from the EU. So you'd be theoretically talking about 60 billion of extra about 120 billion of revenue had the tariffs gone from 0 to 20%. So not a small amount of money. Likewise, not something that's going to clear America's national debt in a hurry, which is around the 36 trillion mark. That's the sort of numbers that we're talking about. But what are we going to see a genuine difference quickly? Well, maybe so in the stock market. As I say, will American businesses benefit quickly from manufacturing coming back onshore into the US? There are a number of reasons why you might want to do that, especially after the pandemic. There was a point in the pandemic at which it was revealed that America imports 90% of its pharmaceuticals from China. Obviously, that was pretty significant at the time, and still remains pretty significant from a security perspective. And that's something that is much more on the table now. Our energy security was not being discussed at all in the UK until Ukraine and Russia, and the knock-on effect of that and what that did to gas prices, apart from anything else. And therefore suddenly energy security becomes more important. We've gone down a route of let's get the cheapest thing from wherever we can, and then we'll be fine. We'll therefore that will help everybody because it helps the consumer. Now, another argument is it can be quite disinflationary for consumers in other countries, which would be quite good news in places like the UK, although it's not necessarily the goods where we've been struggling over the past few years in inflation. It's the services and the utilities, and that's continuing to happen with awful April, or however you want to refer to it as. But it could be disinflationary, so inflation going down, not necessarily going into reverse, but reducing. Why would it be disinflationary? Well, the argument is that ultimately, because exporters can't export as much because their price has gone up in a way that they can't control, they're going to sell less at a higher price, but they're not going to get all the benefits of that higher price. Again, that's sort of basic economics, supply and demand, right? So that needs to be considered. So what do? Well, they look more to the domestic market and say, actually, we need to move some more product here. How do we move more product? Well, we reduce our prices and we sell more to domestic consumers to make up for the fact we're not selling as much abroad. So It then gets more complex as you go on because it depends what you're talking about. So when we're talking about Bentleys and Jaguar and Land Rovers and things like that, think cars that get exported to the US, then the consideration is ultimately how price sensitive are those customers. And if you're in the market for a luxury car, I'm not sure. Of course, you get some people who are just completely led by the brand, or at the moment, if you looked at Tesla, for example, you would say completely put off by the brand. You could argue there's a percentage of consumers in the market who are going to be that way inclined, right? And then there's going to be people who are willing to consider, if you're talking about BMW, you're going to consider Jaguar, you're going to consider Mercedes, you're going to consider Audi, you're going to consider Tesla, maybe you're going to consider Lexus, you're going to consider all sorts of other potential brands. So there are substitutes in there as well. So at the individual level, every single manufacturer and the strength of their brand will have a price sensitivity. At the very perverse end of a luxury goods scale, the more the price goes up, the more people want it. And of course, luxury producers really understand this sort of scarcity principle and the signal that a price sends to a market. So if Rolex started producing a watch for 500 quid, it might devalue every single Rolex that was out there, even if they sold millions and millions of those. What do they do instead? They produce watches at £100,000 or more these days, but they only make 250 of them, and you need to be on that exclusive list in order to get that watch. And sometimes, as I understand it, not that I'm on any of these lists, but you need to buy that watch even if you don't really like it to stay on the list, so that when another watch comes out, you'll quite enjoy it. And they're quite negative about people who sell them, although of course when they are sold, they struggle to keep track of things like watches. So that's the sort of potential firm level result. So what does it do? As I say, potentially increases US inflation, which increases US bond yields as well, potentially disinflationary for other countries. So perhaps we'll see the UK bonds depart slightly from the US bonds in this department, although I'm not sure that we will. Mark's tuned in there, I can see, and he's asking for the. I haven't actually done the impression yet, Mark. So perhaps it's a good time to say they're my favourite word in the whole dictionary, a beautiful word, tariffs. Tariffs. But are they a beautiful? And it does make me wonder, if you want to move a factory, let's say, and it's not a decision you're going to make lightly, and it isn't something that's going to take place overnight or even within a couple of years. US presidencies are quite short, they're 4 years long. We're already 3 months in. So we've got 3 3/4 years left. I know some car manufacturers this morning will be counting down those 3 3/4 years. But how do you know who's going to win next? Under the current constitution, it can't be Mr. Trump, and it seems that it's unlikely that the constitution could be changed or anything like that. Will it be his continuity candidate, whoever that is, one of his children, JD Vance, any number of other people you might speculate it could be? Or will the Democrats sort themselves out and win the next US election? And might they reverse all this anyway? Because the initial response over the next, and could be 3 months to 3 years, will be pain. American recession will now be probably priced into odds on by the markets at this time until the next change in mind, focus, whatever the next move is going to be. If we're going to a couple of days' time, is that going to be this blanket implementation that he suggested? Of everything that he's done so far, you would think almost certainly not. That's almost certainly not going to be the time, the day at which he suddenly does this. I can't imagine how many negotiations going on around the world at the moment. We can see and hear what's going on in the UK. There's been speculation they'd like to negotiate on the digital services tax. It's a relatively small amount of money, though, compared to where tariffs and what tariffs can raise. And it's very difficult, really, at a base level, outside the 1 or 2% of people who really understand the implications of tariffs, to the person on the street. To the typical Trump voter, it looks pretty fair, doesn't it? In fact, it looks like the US are being quite kind. We're only doing half of what you're doing to us, and you started it, sort of thing, even if that's not necessarily true, of course. And then it does seem to say, in my mind, leave runway for Trump to go, well, actually, instead of doing half, right, we'll come up to what you're doing to us because we don't like the way the negotiations are going. And do you know what? Actually, remember that time when we were charging half? You've ripped us off for years. This is the language that he's using. So actually, we'll do double what you're doing to us. We'll do double, and we're going to go to 200, 400%, wherever it needs to be. A new era of protectionism is how some people are putting it this morning. There were I read a number of things every morning. One of them is an excellent newsletter called Points of Return by John Authors that he does most days. And this morning he quotes the great John McEnroe saying, "Yeah, you cannot be serious." The chart that was whipped out shows things like 67% tariffs charged by China, therefore 34% reciprocal, and then this 10% base. Now, interestingly, the yield on the 10-year bond dropped hugely, but about 12 basis points when Trump produced his chart. And that seems to me a relatively strange reaction, but I guess what it's saying is the odds of a recession, which would mean that interest rates would come down, that effect is much greater than the fact that this is likely to be inflationary in the short term. Market dropped about a little bit over 150 points pretty quickly in the futures, and gold popped itself, was all over the place really, but spiked itself up to over $3,135. But then often it's seen that when the US does this, they go to sleep, Asia wakes up, starts trading, pretty significant drops in all sorts of stuff. The worst hit stock was Nike, down about 7% after the speech, but there are quite a few. Looking at Nvidia, looking at Tesla, down 5% plus after these announcements, and the market's down about 3.75 in terms of the S&P after hours, or the futures on the Nasdaq down more than 4%. So pretty significant, right? Pretty significant. So this is seen as being higher. Someone has calculated, looking at 50 countries' imports on the chart, 50 countries made up 68% of all their imports. If you applied those 50 and then applied the flat 10%, your weighted average tariff rate is 23% into the US. So he sees it as ending up likely between 25 and 30%, which is higher than the average effective tariff rate of about 20% in 1933. So, yeah, indeed, Daniel, I do agree. There's obviously the two factors going on, and the probability of the recession is outweighing the fact that it will be inflationary. And this is interesting because if you think back to sort of 2021, all the thought was, well, the economy's going to be so weak, even though all that money had been pumped in, whether you talk about the US or the UK or anywhere else around the world, then what you were expecting was that rates would struggle to go up. However, the spectre of inflation was so strong, and of course it ended up being very strong, over 11% in the UK, apart from anything else, the interest rates just had to go up. There was no choice. So it's always a bit of a trade-off. And at the moment, the probability of the recession is winning the arm wrestle over and above the fact that the US is already above its inflation target. And this brings back in, word of the quarter, possibly word of the year so far that we've seen being mentioned again and again, stagflation. And what does that ultimately mean? It means stagnant growth, either going backwards a bit or forwards a bit or whatever. Significant inflation. Again, how do you define significant? But you certainly say anything above 4% is pretty significant in worlds where you're trying to keep the target at 2%. And certainly in the US, if it goes above 3%, they start suggesting it's pretty significant. What's the other element of stagflation, though? Ultimately, it's unemployment, or unemployment shooting upwards. Are people likely to lose their jobs? Well, speculation this morning in the UK, 25,000 car manufacturing jobs at risk. That's a potential problem. Of course, it's not only cars, but they are the big ticket item. But I did describe earlier on about the complexities with the OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers, and getting parts from all over the world in order to assemble them in a place. What's going to happen to car prices is very complex. But ultimately, again, when you think about the more simple economic effects, new car production is likely to go down around the world. used car production and usage is likely to go up. Why? Because used cars aren't going to be subject to these tariffs ultimately. So the used car market could boom again. Again, this was something that happened in COVID, but it was something that would happen more because new cars simply weren't made. So there was a supply shortage. Now this is more that there's going to be a reaction to a demand drop. Why would the demand drop? Because of the price shock ultimately here. So, some people are going as far as saying that this is a recession, around the world recession. If these tariff rates stay on for an extended period of time, it's around the world recession. Now we saw if we were hit by 20% tariff, which is what the OBR talked about in their recently released forecast, which was kind of their worst case scenario. There's some people saying, well, he's talking about 25% and this and that across the board. 20% would potentially hit our GDP growth by about 0.6, 0.7%, which is not great when you're only forecasting 1% growth. And of course, it has an impact across the rest of the forecast as well. So we were lucky, really, we had the budget when we did have it, and not after Liberation Day, or whatever you want to call it. So what sort of revenue would it raise? Sort of $600 billion is what he's looking for, 2.2% of the US GDP, twice the size of the largest tax increase in modern US history. This would be confusing to people who were thinking there's going to be significant tax cuts in the US, because that's what they're expecting from Trump. It really does depend, because you have to consider, is he serious about reducing the deficit? Because the deficit has been increasing out of control. The national debt has been increasing out of control. It's put on something like 8 trillion in the last 4 or 5 years. It's just an unthinkable amount of money. So 600 billion doesn't sound like a lot in the context of that, but of course that would be an annual revenue raising. I probably should also just mention VAT, because there's been some kind of strange bastardization, really, or misunderstanding of VAT in this whole situation, in that Trump has seen it as a tariff, and I think part of his argument is because it goes to central government in the UK, whereas really it's just the equivalent of his sales taxes, but the sales taxes go to the states in the US rather than the federal government. It's just the way the tax system works over there. There is no real difference I can see between VAT and sales tax. Although having said that, I'm not sure whether sales tax is only levied at the point of sale and there is no VAT business, no sales tax business to business or similar, and it's only at the retail consumer level, in which case it would make it different because there isn't reclaiming and all the rest of it. But VAT and sales tax are not primarily different. They are an increase in the price of a good that then is going to a government organisation that is therefore increasing the price of the good to the consumer and affecting how much of it they buy, apart from anything else, right? You do wonder how much of this is truly understood by, well, certainly at the Trump level, but certainly at the level of the people that are driving this in the administration. It is a big shift to the way that the world has worked, but it also fits in with the way that the world is moving away from a open borders, collaborative style solution to an isolationist, protectionist. And look, let's make no bones about it, the EU is a protectionist organisation. Yeah, it's always been a protectionist organisation. It's a big part of the reason why it exists. So to an extent, can you blame the US for this shift at this point? We'll see what happens. Canada have said they're going to retaliate. They're already have their own tariffs. None of their stuff has changed, as I understand it, in what's happened yesterday. Will Keir Starmer retaliate? I don't know. It seems at the moment like there's two ways of looking at it, isn't there? One, is he playing well by letting the big man pick on everybody else and just sort of placating him a little bit and remaining fairly quiet? Is retaliation a good idea? Most people think retaliation is probably not a good idea, especially as it might just pour petrol on the fire. And as I said, he could quite easily go up to the level of tariff that he's talking about. Equalise them. He could even double them if he doesn't like what he's doing. China's a big one. China's a very big one, because China may well export more to other countries now instead of the US, and that would again be disinflationary in other countries around the world. But if it overall reduces global demand, it overall shrinks the potential size of global growth, it can't be making everybody around the world better off net. There's no two ways about it. But let's see where we get to. I think that'll do for the moment. Not a huge amount of property implications there. I know it's all macro, but we're really thinking about what will it do to our economy. Will it increase it? The sort of job numbers that are being talked about are not materially horrific. We don't want to lose those jobs, of course we don't, but not incredibly bad. And in terms of sort of inflation, it might not be the worst thing in the world, but in terms of business confidence, it doesn't do us any favours. If we lose some major employers because they do relocate factories to the USA, that's a real big shame. And also, to an extent, is Trump getting what he wants, isn't it? Which doesn't necessarily feel right. But we just need to get used to this new world where we have sort of semi-allies, which, in fairness, I think is probably the old world. You know, foreign policy has always been a pretty brutal behaviour, but we have clubbed together. Democratic nations in the world have clubbed together. And one of my bigger fears with the way that the route that Trump goes down is there are things in there that are anti-democratic. There are things that are autocratic. It doesn't like being challenged. It cancels people who criticise him. There's talk about judges that really shouldn't be happening in a country with a solid rule of law. I've talked a bit over the last few months about how perhaps the UK wins a bit here by default because rich people want to leave America, perhaps because people aren't confident in the rule of law and investing money in businesses in America. That won't stop overnight because the gravy train doesn't just grind to a halt. But if the UK is a net beneficiary of that, so much the better. Let's see what happens. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. Let's see what happens.